Well, there was record turnout in the 2020 election, but that was despite, not because of, our current election infrastructure, voter purges, closure of polling places, and other voter suppression measures were still present in the 2020 elections. But now there are efforts underway to seriously address the very real issue of voter suppression. And one of the groups working around this is the Declaration for American Democracy Coalition. And the director of the coalition, Jenna Morgan, joins us now. Hello, Jenna. Thank you so much for being with us. Give us a sense of what we saw in terms of voter suppression tactics in the 2020 election.
Absolutely. And let me just say thank you so much for having me on to talk about these important issues. For many people, we did have an election that had historic turnout, which was absolutely phenomenal. We have to remember that there were numerous hoops that voters had to jump through as various elected officials tried to throw up roadblocks to stop people from voting during a historic pandemic. One thing to kind of harken back to was the 2013 decision in Shelby County v. Holder that took down some of the protections of the Voting Rights Act. And that cleared the way for many states like Texas, Florida, and Georgia to enact racist anti-voter laws that purposefully targeted Black and Brown communities. And we've also seen efforts to suppress the vote of elderly voters, voters with disabilities, low-income families, and other groups that have been marginalized by our political system. But more specifically, some of the tactics that they used were signature match requirements, where if your license, for example, if you had a hyphenated last name or an accent in your license and then you signed it, they could use not putting that hyphen in as a reason to throw out your ballot. There were requirements to have somebody witness you signing your ballot. Again, in a pandemic when people are supposed to be, not congregating together, that's an impediment to potentially voting. Voter purges, as you mentioned, obviously targeting communities of color were rampant. There were almost 20,000 polling places shut down across the country, meaning long lines, long drives, and difficult access to get to their polling stations, and residential address requirements that specifically targeted Native American communities, just to name a few.
Because we have such a patchwork quilt, it seems, of voting regulations, it does seem that it is a landscape that's just rife for these kind of abuses, because you have a state, say, like Colorado, that has had mail-in ballots, mail-in voting for years and have proven to be very successful and very safe. You have other counties, let alone other states around the country, that have very different voting rights. I mean, take us through what we're looking at as a country, this, as I said, patchwork quilt of voting regulations, and how that contributes to voter suppression and voter confusion and maybe then voter apathy.
Absolutely, and I think a patchwork quilt is a great way to describe it. And I want to talk about that, but I want to talk about kind of a quick positive on that, and that the bill that we're working on, the For the People Act, HR 1, is based on the good progressive laws that allow more access for people to vote. Very popular laws like requirements on automatic voter registration, allowing for mail-in balloting. Those are all parts of HR 1, and they've been proven to be broadly supported, across party lines in the states where those exist. But that's exactly the problem in the states where those exist. They don't exist in every single state. And so actually Americans do not have free and fair access across the board to the electoral process. And there really needs to be a bottom line of access so that everyone can have their voice heard. And I would just say at the start of taking on this position that I have with the Declaration for American Democracy, before the pandemic, I was lucky enough to travel to meet with partners in states like Colorado, Maine, North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona. And the conversations I had about how people could access the vote in Colorado or Maine were wildly different than the requirements to vote in Georgia and Arizona. And a lot of the voter suppression tactics that I just mentioned were in place in states like Arizona and Georgia. And that's what I think most Americans don't understand, is that just because it might be easy for you to vote in your state doesn't mean that it's the same across the board. And that is a real problem that the For the People Act is looking to fix.
Well, let's talk specifically about that piece of legislation, HR 1, the For the People Act. This predates the 2020 election. It goes back a while, albeit now there's an increased sense of urgency. Take us through some of those things that it will tangibly address. I mean, you said it would really create a baseline so that all voters would have a very bare minimum level of protection. I mean, things like that seem like such common sense, like automatic voter registration is part of that. But take us through some of the details in HR1.
Absolutely. So the For the People Act, which was originally introduced in the House in 2019 and passed in the House and then introduced in the Senate, where unfortunately it went to die in Mitch McConnell's legislative graveyard, has been reintroduced in this House on January 4th and also has been designated as S1 in the Senate, which means it is one of the top priorities for Congress. So the For the People Act is the boldest democracy reform since Watergate. It is a massive overhaul of voting, money in politics, and ethics laws, all to make our democracy more inclusive and more accountable. And I can talk about just briefly some of the main buckets of the legislation. So first and foremost, securing and expanding voting rights, making automatic voter registration something for all people across the United States, having at least 2 weeks of early voting, allowing for online voter registration, which people cannot do across the country. In some places, you can only do, voter registration in person or through the mail. So these are, like we said, kind of those baselines for people to being able to access the ballot. It will also create nonpartisan commissions to draw districting lines. So it would end gerrymandering in our political system, which is often partisan or even racially motivated when those lines are drawn. And we think that elected officials should not be able to pick their voters. It's voters who should be picking who represents them in office. And so getting rid of partisan gerrymandering will go a long way towards doing that. The next is money in politics. We're going to be able to shine a light on dark money in our political system, which we often see laws passed that favor major corporate donors and not, the will of the people themselves. And it will offer new opportunities for people to run for office who aren't backed by corporate donors, so that people will have a government that actually reflects the diversity of this country. And then finally, it will tackle transparency and accountability issues in our political system, instituting a new suite of important ethics laws.
Well, I want to talk about gerrymandering specifically, because I'm not sure that's a term that everybody fully understands, and yet it has massive implications for voting in the country. But I do want to let viewers know, let us know what your experience has been in voting. Leave us a comment, tell us where you are and what your laws are, and maybe what you're concerned about, what's working, what's not working. But gerrymandering, as I said, Janet, this is a term many people are familiar with, but don't fully understand. What exactly is it, and why should we be so vigilant when it comes to this issue?
Absolutely. So gerrymandering means, or I should say, drawing the lines of a district means figuring out who gets to vote in a particular district. So, when I lived in New York, I was in New York 21, and there was lines that drew that district. It's supposed to be kind of a disbursement based on population. You would imagine it might look like, circles or squares, something that would be kind of impartial, bringing people together in a specific area. But what gerrymandering has actually done is you'll see districts that look like strings, or districts that look like a bunch of different bubbles, and they don't touch, but it's all one district. And what it does is it tries to take people of certain groups and disenfranchise them, or putting people from certain groups into one area, so that you will only have someone getting elected. If you take people from a particular party, and you put them in one area, it'll be only those people, that get one representative. But you can draw lines in a way that benefits a particular party, so that, you'll get 5 representatives from one party and 1 from another, when if the districts had been drawn fairly and not like dots or squiggles, you might have 3 from one party, 2 from another.
When we're seeing such changing demographics in the US, particularly in states like Georgia and Arizona, that did ultimately go blue in the presidential election, is gerrymandering coming into play there? Where are we seeing this playing out, particularly as we're seeing the demographics change and people wondering, well, how come we're not seeing necessarily that being reflected in the election results?
Yeah, and I think that's because many districts have been, gerrymandered to all get out, where certain people, it's often, again, we've seen it happen in a way that's racially motivated. We've seen it happen in a way that's partisan, motivated. People are kind of pushed into one district so that all the people that might vote a certain way have one representative, and more broadly, folks who might vote for another political party are shunted to, in different places and shunted aside. This is particularly important right now because we've just run a census, and the census is going to be the basis for new redistricting. And, usually the party in power in a particular state gets to draw those lines. And so if that party is able to draw those lines, they're oftentimes going to draw them in favor of their party to maintain power, so that they can continue to be overrepresented, so that they can continue to kind of draw those lines again. And so what HR 1 would do is it will create non-partisan redistricting commissions, so that those lines are fairly drawn. And again, so that the politicians are not picking their voters, that the voters actually get to elect who represents them.
Well, as we said, we saw massive voter turnout in 2020, despite the efforts to suppress the vote. And this was largely in part to organisations like yours and many other groups that were really working on the ground to get out the vote. But it wasn't just about getting people to cast their ballots. It was really a broader voter education mission as well. So do you think we're going to see that reflected in, say, midterm elections or local elections, where, don't forget, election officials themselves, like local secretaries of states, will be elected? Is there now more of an understanding about how elections work because of everything that happened in 2020? Is there a possibility we'll see candidates running to challenge the status quo in some of these states where we're seeing these voter suppression methods?
I think definitely people are now more aware of the importance of secretaries of state around the country, local elected officials, and the real-time impacts they can have on your ability to access the ballot. And we did see during the pandemic, across party lines, secretaries of state doing their best to try and make sure people could vote in a free and fair way. But we do also see others that, don't take that perspective. And I think that's why HR 1 is so critical, because it will create that baseline for minimum standards of voter access requirements, so that more people will be able to go out there and have their voice heard.
Well, this week, of course, we have the Senate impeachment trial of Donald Trump related to what happened on January 6th. Also today, officials in Georgia said that they are criminally investigating that phone call made by Donald Trump to Georgia election officials, trying to sway the vote there. What's the connection between that and voter suppression overall? Is there a connection?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you saw the President of the United States specifically asking a Secretary of State to find the votes to put him over the top in the state, basically asking him to suppress the votes of the millions of people who went out and made their voice heard in Georgia. And that's wrong. That's not how our democracy works. And this came on the heels of months and months and months of misinformation, lies, propaganda, telling people in more liberal or more blue states to not vote by mail, and how bad it was. But then at the other side of their mouth, out of the mouth of that administration, telling folks in Florida or Pennsylvania, yes, it's safe to vote by mail, encouraging people to do it. And so you just saw rampant misinformation, attempting to suppress the vote, attempting to undermine faith in our democracy. And I think the people, when they turned out and they voted in November, they demonstrated that they had enough. They voted for pro-democracy reformers. We have pro-democracy reformers now in all three branches of government. So I think right now, the important thing to note is that we have a mandate for change to our system, for a democracy that actually reflects, represents, and responds to the people. And I think our elected officials are ready to do that. And we need to keep up the pressure to make sure they, keep that promise to change our system to actually be one that is reflective of our country.
Well, aside from HR1 at a federal level, there are efforts in states, some states to improve voter access, but in other states to continue to suppress the vote. And that's also happening in Georgia, where election officials there were being lauded as heroic for pushing back and upholding the very basic laws when they went up against Donald Trump and his efforts to overturn democracy. At the same time, they're also pushing for more voter suppression laws like voter ID and different things. So where should people be paying attention to? What states are you most concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, despite the our largest turnout in modern history for this last election, rather than legislatures securing these gains, codifying the progress we made and the changes that we made for pandemic voting, we're seeing legislators try to knock that down. And according to the Brennan Center, 165 bills have been introduced in 33 state legislatures to restrict voting access, which is 4 times as many as this time last year. And so, I'd hate to even say, oh, it's only happening in, 1 or 2 places. Obviously, I know things are happening in Georgia. We see efforts in Arizona to take people off the permanent early voting list. But these are happening everywhere. And so people need to pay attention and be vigilant and let their elected officials know that, no, I liked being able to vote by mail. I liked, being able to vote early and being able to register early. People have to let their officials know that and hold them accountable for trying to undermine their ability to access the ballot. And also, they need to let their national elected representatives know that the For the People Act needs to be passed post haste to make sure that these types of voting restrictive bills cannot be passed or implemented in these states.
It does seem that 2020 has really taught us that democracy doesn't happen every 4 years, that you have to show up day in and day out. Voting is just one element of that, but also that our democracy is very vulnerable and that we all need to be vigilant. And I know that there are lots of opportunities, not just around these bills and engaging with your elected officials, but also to really engage with the election process at a local level. There are election judges, there are poll watchers, there are lots of ways for people to really engage with their election system outside of the once every 4 years presidential election.
Absolutely. And, I would encourage people to continue to be involved and, happy to also use this as an opportunity to kind of plug ways that people can get involved in the fight for the For the People Act. We have a number of ways that folks can participate, going to declarationforamericandemocracy.org or dfadcoalition.org, going to our Take Action page. We have ways that you can call your members of Congress, that you can set up in-district virtual meetings with them, ways that you can participate in rallies or other socially distanced kind of interesting events. There's a lot of ways for folks to be involved, and I encourage them to continue to do so, because what held our democracy together this time around was not our institutions. Our institutions are broken right now. It was people, good people who went out and volunteered, as you said, to be election monitors, to run the polling stations, who sounded the alarm on voter suppression efforts. It was the people who got us through this. And we need to make sure that those people don't have to work that hard next time around to ensure a free and fair election. So we need to make these changes to our institutions. We need to do it ASAP. Our elected officials have a mandate. And so we're really looking forward to seeing our elected officials, follow through on their promises. But we do need the people's help. We need your help to continue to keep up the pressure and reach out to your members of Congress, your representatives, your senators, and let them know that this is important to you and that you care about the health of our democracy.
Well, Jenna Morgan with Declaration for American Democracy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And do let us know your experiences with the voting system. Leave a comment, engage with us on Free Speech TV on social media, and join us next Wednesday, same time, same place. We're going to hear about another piece of legislation that would raise the national minimum wage to $15 an hour. That's next Wednesday right here. Thank you.